Our big story is all about infrastructure. And yes, we did plan this because of the president's visit to Portland today, where he talked about infrastructure.
You know, the last guy that had this job talked about infrastructure week. Every week he talked about infrastructure week. It didn't come for 4 years. Well, I gave you infrastructure decade. This is for 10 years.
So what does this mean specifically for Oregon? OPB has a pretty good breakdown of how funding from the president's infrastructure bill will be spent in our state. State transportation officials say Oregon will get more than $1 billion over 5 years. They plan to spend $50 million on highway projects, $80 million on safety upgrades for main streets and routes to school, $75 million on maintenance projects, and $40 million will go to ODOT's budget. Now, I know that's not $1 billion. There is a ton more money. That's just some quick highlights. During his speech today, the president also said this.
This year alone, we're delivering $662 million to fix roads and bridges in Oregon, plus an additional $53 million in dedicated funding for bridges.
Bridges, eh? What could that mean? Federal funding for the long-delayed I-5 bridge over the Columbia River? You know, the one that will likely fall down during a major earthquake if it's not repaired soon? Well, President Biden didn't say anything specifically about that, and that might be disappointing for some of you. Earlier this week, we asked you what you wanted to hear the president talk about, and Pat, not me, but another Pat, sent in this email. Of huge importance is the replacement of the I-5 bridge. It is nothing less than an economic aorta for the Pacific Coast. It is far past its life expectancy in both capacity and ability to survive an earthquake. Nothing less than a red lights and siren attitude needs to be adopted, as it needs to be replaced now. Thanks for that email, Pat. Before the president's speech, a union worker introducing him said this.
We are ready to rebuild the I-5 bridge over the Columbia River.
Heard a little hooting and hollering there from the crowd. But again, the president did not talk specifically about the interstate bridge. That does not mean the replacement project is stalled, though, not at all. In fact, project leaders believe President Biden is paying attention to them.
President Biden spoke of our project back in January. So that lets us know that this project is of national significance. So we think that this is the right time to get this thing done.
And last week, Washington Senator Maria Cantwell said the project is a great candidate to get federal funding through a new grant program. That's also part of the president's infrastructure bill. Plans for the bridge just have to be finalized first. And good news on that front, because today we got a big update. Project leaders have decided that light rail will be part of a new I-5 bridge. How about that? The plan is to have TriMet's MAX trains cross the river with a stop at Vancouver's waterfront before going north on I-5 up to a C-Tran transit hub near Evergreen Boulevard. There are still other decisions to be made, like how many merge and exit lanes the bridge would have, and not everyone's on board with the idea of light rail. Washington Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler released a statement this week saying light rail has been rejected repeatedly by voters in Southwest Washington by overwhelming margins. However you feel about it, this is definitely a step forward for the massive project, though, that's been stalled in the past, and it has a long, long history. We're finally learning about some key design choices for the planned replacement for the interstate bridge, including the selection of light rail as the included mode of mass transit. And if you're a Portland or Vancouver resident, you're probably thinking, wait a minute, haven't we done this already? And yes, you'd be right. So how did we get here? Again? The interstate bridge's two spans date back to 1917 and 1958, and they share several deficiencies, including no shoulder lanes, a claustrophobic pedestrian walkway, and a drawbridge segment that regularly grinds traffic to a halt. And there's a less visible problem, as illustrated by this video from the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program Office. The bridge's columns rest on pilings that don't actually reach all the way down to the bedrock, which means they could be dislodged by soil liquefaction. In other words, when the big one, the Cascadia megaquake, arrives, the bridge is not the place you're going to want to be.
Anthony, this bridge has been talked about for over a quarter of a century. It goes back to the 90s.
That's Greg Johnson, program administrator for the current replacement effort. The first attempt at a modern replacement was the Columbia River crossing, which got started in 2004. The project got pretty far into the planning process, including the selection of a locally preferred alternative, or LPA, which is a conceptual design that finalizes the high-level details like how many lanes the new bridge will have and where it will cross the river. The LPA also specified that the new bridge would include light rail, which you might recall became a bit controversial on the Washington side of the river and played a role in the collapse of the project after the Washington Senate failed to advance the state's share of construction funding in 2013. There were also disagreements about the bridge's height and the expected tolling revenue. Failure left Oregon and Washington with a new problem. They'd already spent about $140 million in federal funding on the Columbia River crossing, and that money was contingent on the new bridge getting built. The deadline was several years down the road, but eventually the states would either need to restart the project or pay the money back.
So the feds are actually looking at that provision and seeing if that is still something that they want to do. But that was part of the impetus to get this back going. But really, the impetus is that this is a growing region that is dependent upon two bridges to cross the Columbia River. And one is already vastly overused, the I-205 Glenn Jackson Bridge, carries 170,000 vehicles per day. And the second bridge is a 105-year-old bridge that, once again, is outdated and carries 143,000 vehicles per day.
The decision to restart came in 2019. Both state legislatures allocated some initial funding, and Governors Kate Brown and Jay Inslee opened a new bi-state development office, resulting in the creation of the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program, which probably not coincidentally does not include the words Columbia or river or crossing anywhere in the title. State lawmakers and project officials have sought to portray the new project as a return to the drawing board with a from-scratch design process. But it isn't an entirely fresh start. The Columbia River Crossings LPA had already gone through the federal environmental review process and gotten a green light by the time the project stalled out. That federal approval is still valid, and state officials hope to save time and money by reusing it for the new project with a supplemental update. But that means the new design has to stick at least relatively closely to the original. Critics have argued that the constraint makes the new project little more than a redressed Columbia River crossing, and that it would be an ill-advised freeway expansion at a time when cutting carbon emissions should be paramount. But project officials insist they still have room to change up the design to address the ways in which the region has grown and changed in the past decade, and to make some fundamental improvements, including adding new design criteria to better address climate and equity issues. So, where do things stand right now?
We're not quite caught up to where CRC, because CRC achieved the last federal approval step. They received a record of decision. They had permits in place. So all of those things have to be redone, and that's the process that getting this locally preferred alternative and taking it through the supplemental process. By the time we are done with that, that's when we will have pretty much caught up to where CRC was.
At the very least, the new project has already managed to dodge the specific bullet that killed its predecessor. The Washington legislature approved $1 billion earlier this year to cover the state's half of the construction funding. A new conceptual design is not far behind. The program office narrowed it down to two possible configurations today. They both include light rail, but they differ in the number of auxiliary lanes on the bridge and the configuration of the interchanges on the Portland side of the river. The office is scheduled to choose one of those two as its final recommendation at a meeting in May. The goal is for state lawmakers and partner agencies to review the proposal and give it a thumbs up in July. The next few years would be spent on design work, with construction beginning in 2025 if everything stays on track.
If we're going to hit those dates, we need to have a series of things happen. And so this is the first domino that needs to fall, is that we go into the supplemental environmental impact statement this summer. So that's the reason we have that July date set out there. We're also going to have to come before the Oregon legislature during their 2023 session to to match what the Washington State Legislature has done as far as funding commitments, then that allows us to start getting in line and applying for federal grants to help define what the funding picture will look like for this bridge.
As for what's on the way this year, we can expect to see a lot of public discussion about the proposed bridge design. We'll also find out whether light rail remains as much of a hot-button issue as it was 10 years ago, and whether the IBR program can manage to chart a course through it and any other controversial aspects of the design.
We know that those issues are going to be very intense, and there's passion on both sides of it. So our goal is to present the technical merits of each of the choices that we make, and recognizing that, once again, this is not just a local bridge. This is an international connector between Mexico and Canada on the West Coast that connects a lot of ports and moves goods and services for vast differences headed all over the United States and actually all over the world. So we have to keep that as a backdrop, that this is not just a local bridge. But we have done the analysis, and we are ready for the discussion of what our choices that our team is going to put forward.
And that's how we got here.